Department of Revenue and Taxation, specifically the director, deputy director, the deputy tax commissioner, and the driver's license supervisor. Reference to the issues on the real ID and anything related to driver's license. All right? I'd like to recognize that Senator Will Castro has joined me for this roundtable discussion, and currently present is the director, John Camacho, deputy director, Marie Benito, deputy tax commissioner, Paul Pablo, and the driver's license supervisor, Jesse Salas. We will keep all your statements all in reference to driver's license. We may expand from there, but we try to keep it within that area. All right? I'd like to thank the people of Guam for joining us today and being able to hear exactly what are the problems and what's going on at Revenue and Tax. We will begin with the Deputy Director for his opening comments and any comments he wants to bring up in reference to driver's license.
Thank you, Chairman San Agustin, and also a member of the committee, for having us here to talk about Guam driver's license, and specifically also as it relates to the Guam Real ID Act. And as you know, I just want to talk briefly about the Real ID Act history and where we've gone from way back to now. And but before we continue that, I guess as to my left is my Deputy Director, Marie, Paul, the Deputy Tax Commissioner, and Jesse, the Supervisor for examination, for driver's license branch. And basically, this Real ID, I guess, was enacted back in 2005, which basically Congress modified the federal law as certification cards. And again, it prohibits federal agencies from accepting for official purposes, licenses and identification card from states that do not meet those standard requirements. I guess since then, I think a lot of states have made those progress, meaning it's a little bit better now than it is before the 9/11, which what basically the commission wanted to do is to establish those vetting process moving forward. What I really wanted to straight out forward basically is this Real ID required by law? No, it is not. It is a voluntarily for each individuals to opt in into this basically requirements where they get vetted, where they present their certificate, their residency, and their social security card. But at also the same time, we have alternative documents. Basically, if there's no social security card, we would ask basically for W-2s, 1099s for the last 5 years. So with that being said, but mainly one of the reasons why they have this law basically is for the Department of Homeland Security, which basically just moving forward is going to be looking at whether when traveling domestically in the States, you have a Real ID driver's license. And if you're not, then what are the alternatives that you need to travel domestically? And also, basically, if you're entering a federal building and an ID is required, that the ID basically be a Real ID driver's license or something that is acceptable with the federal agency. So those are the things, and I think they're starting to do that now, the airports. I think the law, basically, they're saying starting next year, January 22nd, Department of Homeland Security is going to be looking for those Real ID compliant driver's license. And whether, if there's none, whether the state or jurisdiction has an extended or granted an extension to meet the Real ID compliant moving forward. And at the end, basically, come October 1st, 2020, I think Department of Homeland Security is going to require that all people traveling domestically and also entering federal buildings that require identification that they be Real ID compliant, or again, another basically acceptable means of identification before they enter the federal building. With that basically being said, I wanted to give a little bit of history of where we went with this Real ID. I believe we started way back. We started to receive funds from the Department of Homeland Security. I think a total funds from the Homeland Security of about $2.some million to improve our facilities, buy equipments, and so forth. So we've been doing that some time ago, and we, as you know, the department, if you enter those driver's license cubicle, that's part of the investment that we made, the equipments that we have there, and all the things that we do. And moving along, we hired our vendor, which is Violet USA, to help us basically meet this requirement of Real ID compliant for Guam. And just moving forward, we've been doing that with our vendor. It's time consuming. I know we asked several times to be extended, and they granted that extension, and currently now we're requesting an extension to April 30 next year to be compliant. And just to give you an idea, there's roughly about 39 requirements that we are looking at, and we're down to about 6 or 7, being Social Security being the biggest one that we're working, trying to get our system to work with, I have an MOU with Social Security, so when you come in, we can vet that your Social Security matches the Social Security office with the Social Security Administration office. So with that and with all these things that are happening, of course, it takes time. The line gets longer, and you know, people are spending hour, 2 hours. But it comes to the territory. I think with our vendors, they've been telling us that most states also take time to do these things, and they can stay in line for hours in the states just to do these processes, just to get a driver's license. And I know it's costly. I know we talk about this, Senator, about the cost of these, getting this Real ID compliant moving forward. And maybe in the future, we may probably look at some of the fees that we can probably talk about. With that, you know, the governor has seen that, you know, people are lining too long, so he basically wanted to ease the time to line up. So a month ago, or a little bit over a month ago, we started looking at places to open up a satellite. And I believe the governor went out last week to say that we are opening up a new satellite office in Ganya Shopping Center above Payless that would at least house 8 cubicles to to entertain more renewal of driver's license, and also at the same time dedicate one of that for the online scheduler. So in other words, we're trying to basically ease that line waiting time by adding another 8 to the 8 that we have for the Department of Revenue and Taxation. So those are the things that we're doing. And of course, basically it's costly, and we're doing it, but it's something that we look for, and we apologize for those long lines that we basically been having, but it's required if the taxpayer volunteers to be Real ID compliant. So with that, that's more like a snapshot of what's happening. And I know we talk about making this law on being an optional or voluntary on a Guam law, Senator. So hopefully we can work something to get it in the Guam Code annotated, saying that the Real ID is an optional, and then people that opt in or voluntary wants to comply. At the same time, also next year, we're still looking at getting to be compliant by April 30. So hopefully we will do something for those people that actually came in and were vetted. There's a lot of them that came in. We're looking at that to see what we can do to replace those driver's license with a Real ID compliant people that are already opted into that Real ID compliant driver's license. And if a taxpayer or if a person doesn't volunteer, then there'll be a different type of driver's license that will be issued, which will show something like not Real ID compliant moving forward. So with that, I have Marie, Paul, and and Jesse here to answer any questions that you may have in our process. And we're open for you want to say something, Mary or Paul, first, before you get into the questions?
No, I think your opening was great, Director. I'd like to also recognize the Vice Speaker, Senator Therese Terlai, has joined us also. But I think that I would ask my colleagues first if they wanted to ask a question before we allow your folks to respond or to make any statements, because they may be, I would think, assuming that we're going to ask the questions, and I think it'd be better if we ask, because you gave a great opening. Okay? Senator Castro, you have anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'll ask a question. It's a little more rhetorical, but I'd like it responded to for the record. And then I have some follow-up statements, Mr. Chair. As you know, I'm very concerned about the identification of those who choose to reside on Guam, but I'll save that for later on in the discussion. But my question to the department, it was stated earlier, and it's been made public on more than one occasion, that while participation in the Real ID Act may be elective at this point in time, I've read, and I thank the good chairman and his staff for doing the research, that participation in the Real ID Act by 2020 for purposes of interstate travel is not elective, that in fact it is required by 2020. Is that true or false?
The Real ID Act basically is voluntarily. That's the questions. I mean, that when we look at what the Real ID is saying, but I guess what it's also saying at the same time, that if you want to travel domestically in the States, they'll be looking for those Real ID driver's license. But also at the same time, that if you don't have that Real ID compliance driver's license, basically you have an alternative like a passport, a valid passport, or a military ID, or some acceptable form of the ID that DHS would accept.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, let me just reiterate, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. It's important to note for the record that while participation in the Real ID Act is elective for states and territories, what is not elective by 2020 is that you have a form of Real ID, whether it's the driver's license or whether it's another acceptable form of identification that meets the federal requirements of the Real ID Act. That's really what's so important to communicate to the general public, Mr. Chairman. It's a matter of federal public law. This is not an option for any territory or state within the Union, Mr. Chairman. Let the record reflect that.
Okay. You're asking a question?
No, that was my closing statement.
Oh, okay. No, we'll ask the question before you start, Mr. Pablo, because you may have something you want to ask, and then I'm going to ask a bunch of questions that I know will lead Jesse, will lead Paul into commenting. And I want to be able to lead you on before you start saying a lot of things that there may be a lot of questions that the people of Guam are going to wonder. Okay?
All right.
Senator Terlai.
Well, my number one question would be that I'm happy to hear about the satellite. We had talked about this before. We talked about this in your budget hearing. That was in July, I think, or August, maybe July, or June or July. But, and at that time, I had asked you, people had already been waiting in line for 8 hours, some of them, 7 hours, 6 hours. I think an hour or two is a very underestimate on your part, Mr. Camacho, because we've heard so many stories of way over that time, even my family members. So I know it's correct that, yeah, they bring chairs to sit there for much more than 2 hours. So we'd asked at that time, what are you going to do about this? Why can't we do something about that right now? And you said, by the end of the summer, by August, that would be taken care of, that those lines would go away and that we wouldn't have those lines anymore. But my understanding is that those lines still exist today. And then when we were deliberating the budget on the session floor, and we added the additional employees, one of the questions was, is this going to affect the lines? Is this going to help shorten the line? And I believe that your answer was yes, of course, immediately, right? We could alleviate these lines, but I think today those lines are still long. Is that correct? So I don't know. I guess it's great to hear this about the satellite, but this had been proposed since July, and I just feel so bad for these people who have waited. You know, so many people over the months since you started this have waited. And now I guess I'm curious if it's individually an option for the people when they get up to the I guess the customer service rep, if it's their option. I mean, could we have divided the lines for those who wanted the real ID and those who didn't, so that those who didn't have to stand in those long lines and could have done it the traditional way? And I mean, I thought your explanation before was that once Guam decided to go real ID, that the individuals no longer had an option, and that we all had to comply with real ID. So I guess I'm just curious if an option, you know, exists, if we could make that very clear, and then we could process them quicker without the real ID. And I don't think anybody understood at the time when they were lining up for these long hours that their real ID was not really a real ID, because that was the explanation given. We were converting to real ID. That's why they were waiting. And then we found out, you know, traveling, that it's not really a real ID. And we still have to wait again for Department of Revenue Tax to convert it. That's what you're saying. So I guess I want to know exactly who's working on this conversion versus who's working on processing the people that come in, and how's that all going to work quickly? Yeah. And when did Guam opt in formally, or was this just Department of Revenue Tax decided to go for it? And I mean, or is there anything more formal that's required, or not really? I guess I'm not sure that Mr. Camacho. And I guess I would like to just know very concretely then, moving forward, whether you are going to let everybody know that they have an option, whether we can process those who choose not to get the real ID, those who have passports. You're making it sound like if you have a passport, perhaps it's not necessary to have a real ID. If you carry your passport around and you'll still be able to get into federal buildings, you'll still be able to travel without a real ID. So I want that to be made very clear to the public if that's the case, and then maybe divide up the lines so that those who don't need a real ID because they have passports, we can just process them quicker, or give them that option at least to forego the lines. And if you could just be very concrete in this, how these lines are going to be processed now. You know, some people have to convert the IDs that they've been lining up for the past few months into real IDs. Some people still have to line up for their renewal of their driver's licenses. And yeah, if the 8 people they're still going to line up for hours to get their real ID, even with the 8 people, I guess.
Yes, just to answer your question about trying to get the additional personnel in, and we've been working on that, but it just takes a lot of time and process to get those equipments. And you know, just to get equipment, you have to go to this process to GSA, and they have to bid out, and to get a location, it takes a while. But you know, I guess the waiting time to get the facility ready over at the satellite over above Payless, it's going to come through December 1st, and it's going to add that to our resources, and it's going to cut the waiting time a little bit shorter.
So these are permanent additional equipment that you're buying for
these
the 8
yes,
stations? So
yes.
These will be permanently additional 8 stations?
Yes.
And how long is the contract for the satellite?
Well, we're doing the contract right now, and we intend to extend it because we're moving forward. We extend it for another year, and then we'll see from there. But we're going to try to maintain, you know, the additional resources that we can offer the public to cut down the lines.
You said this is located at a Payless? Which
In
Payless?
Agustin Shopping Center, above
So
second floor.
Was it bid out, the location, or you just chose a location?
Maybe we can.
We're
get
in the process right now of getting the RFP together. Right now, we just did a temporary 3-month rent. so we can get it started. So, you know, as the director stated, it did take us a while. It was a thought in July, and finally in August, that was one of the options that was brought up. And we know that we needed to do something. We needed to find a solution for that because, of course, we sympathize, you know, with the waiting time, and we realize that. But, you know, again, with the senator, the chair, San Agustin, I really appreciate the legislature, the senator, giving us permanent staff. That'll be the permanent solution. This satellite is temporary for a year, and then we'll see if it's successful and if we want to continue that satellite. And as far as the letting the public know, we certainly will. That has been on the table. I know that the director already gave directive to let people know that it's optional. But when we first started this, we wanted to be 100% compliant. Remember that this is also to protect our people as far as ID. You know, the theft ID is very prevalent now, and we wanted to go ahead and help our people by doing that. But we understand, and in consideration of those people that don't have any intention of traveling and just want a driver's license for the privilege of driving, that is an option. And we could, you know, that is one of the options. But when you think about federal mandates, you know that eventually, maybe not now, not 5 years from now, but 10 years from now, everybody is going to have to be on that federal. So right now, you know, we already made that call to make it optional. We've already spoke to the vendors. We're looking at the licenses that will be temporary or not federal, not real ID. It will read not for federal purpose or not for federal use.
And you will be allowing them then to just bring in the material that they used to bring in because so many people have been turned away, said they have to go get all that additional material or information, their social security card, they were all turned away, and then they had to come back and line up again.
Okay.
And then, yeah, and that's why I'm saying I don't think it was explained that it's optional. If you have a passport, you don't need it.
Right, but again, at the time, we wanted to be 100% compliant. But now, you know, in consideration of those people that do not want it for traveling purpose, remember that federal use, entering federal buildings, and that means the base, that means the military installations, all our military people, their dependents, all the federal workers need that real ID. So at that point, we said, you know, let's make it 100%. Because we also wanted to protect their identity. And all these requirements are really, you know, the federal mandates are really hard to complete immediately. So it takes a lot of work, and at that point, we said we were going to be 100% compliant. But because, again, of the outcry of the people, and some do not want to take advantage of that or don't want to opt into a real ID, that's perfectly fine. We will press that out and make sure that it's noted, and all the staff already knows that it's optional. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just go down the line, because you want to talk about the Real ID. The people of Guam can look it up themselves. Real ID Act is an option. Not an option for Guam, or an option for Guam. It never has been a requirement. Let's make that very clear. Number two, if you look at the Guam law, the Guam Code annotated, Title 16, Chapter 3, I'm looking through the law, and I'm going to ask Jesse, because you're the supervisor, what's the difference between getting a real ID and getting the driver's license today, which are required by law to process, not the real ID? What is the difference between the two? What are the requirements that the applicant must bring in?
Well, the difference between the two is when we used to issue the license, we're not vetting all these documents.
You weren't vetting the documents?
No, we weren't vetting documents.
When you say vetting, what do you mean, Jesse, by vetting? You're not really looking and checking if that's the right person, or what?
No, having it be run to a scanner and save it into electronic system.
Okay.
Saved by electronic and saved by photocopies of the documents. Okay. The photocopies of the documents is what we used to do. Now with this real ID, it requires us to save the documents electronically and make sure we have it in our electronic files for at least minimum of 10 years.
Okay.
Now, if it's a hard copy of the document, it's saved to the record with the application, which is minimum of 7 years. Okay. For procurement purposes.
But as far as the requirement of the driver's license, it's pretty much the same of what we require the person to obtain the license.
So it's generally the same thing. The only thing is you don't have a copy. That's what you mean by vetting, right?
Yes.
You don't have a copy of their driver's license. You don't have a copy of their birth certificate. It just bothers me, and for some people here in Guam, is why the mayor's certification requirement when we're not like in the States where you could be in Orange County and you could move to Sacramento, versus on Guam, you could be in Manila today, and you go up to driver's license and get a driver's license, show Manila, and tonight you're moving to Dedidu. And that doesn't make sense. And that's why I'm kind of hesitant on that one. And I'm looking at the real ID, and it talks about residence requirements, but we're in Guam. We're not 50 miles
to satisfy
apart.
that part of the section of the law as the residence is because physically where is this person living in, which Guam, in actuality, we pose the mailing address on the driver's license.
Correct.
With any state license, it poses the residence address.
Okay.
So when we started with this address, they came out with the mayor, which is the office that issues this and certified that this person did in fact live in this section or this village in Guam.
But does the certification state the house number, street number, and everything from the mayor's office?
Yes.
It does?
It does.
Oh, okay.
If the
okay.
person is living in an apartment, it gives the
It'll identify.
It gives the name of the apartment and the street name.
Which is quite good because then it allows the mayor's office to update their listing.
At the same time,
because it's quite
update
evident
it.
the mayors don't have a current listing. Okay, and then I go back to the law, okay, and I'll ask the director and deputy director. 2005, 2008, 2010, now it's 2017. When does the department plan on submitting some sort of draft or recommended changes to the law? It's already over, what, 9 years? Or 2005 will make it 12 years? And I know that the deputy tax commissioner is like, he can understand why I'm asking this question because as you say, it's an option. It was publicized, it's not an option. And because it's an option, I know you have a different vendor that's running your real ID. And I'm trying to understand is why didn't the data migrate and so that, you know, when Jesse's folks are looking at it and they say, you're such and such, yes, you were recorded here, I need to get a copy of your, and that would have been another easier route. I know that would have sped up the line because that same individual could have brought a copy of his Social Security. Because you making a copy cost the department money versus it might have cost the individual only 10 cents at any copying express, okay? And then at the same token, when you talk about the Real ID Act, it's in the code, the federal code, it's only for entry into federal installation. I'm military retired, the Real ID Act will not apply to me because why? I can enter the base anytime I want. I got a military ID card, okay? For any of the vendors that work there, they're issued a military identification card. Unless you're a short-term vendor, then you better get a Real ID Act from wherever you want to get it from, okay? But I just wanted to know why the vendor involved was not migrating the data. And anyone can answer that. Sir?
Hi, Senator. Good morning.
Morning, sir.
I just wanted to add to Mr. Salas's statements regarding, you know, what is the difference between the real ID processing right now and the old processing. He hit it right on the dot. One of the biggest requirements of the Real ID Act is that we store data digitally, and it's to create a database to ensure that, you know, even more stringent authentication for those who come forward to apply for the driving privilege are also the real persons behind that. And they're permitted to be in the United States. And again, going back to the history, it was all about 9/11 and ensuring that what was the alternative to kind of weed out identity theft and terrorism. So the big difference with the states and Guam's requirements is generally the mayor's certification. And you know, if you take a look at some of the states, especially Hawaii, and we talked about modeling Hawaii because it being the same melting pot that Guam is, having that diverse type of, whether they're military veterans, whether they're visa entry status, or whether they're residents, they have almost the same type of individuals there. And the talk about using a GPA bill or a real property tax bill or even a utility bill in lieu of the mayor's certification, on Guam, the households have, you know, sometimes multiple families living. And sometimes even when there's a individual who passes away, for purposes of, you know, whatever it is, even the name of the decedent isn't changed on the utility bill. So that was one of Guam's ways of saying, how can we accommodate the way the actual operations here in Guam is, and the other, the alternative document was the mayor's certification. So that's really the big difference with why. And you know what, honestly, Senator, I just to add a little bit to what the director was saying, and the deputy director, the Real ID Act, for example, is exactly voluntary to participate. There are some states that have even mandated that they do not spend a single penny on participating in that. And their concerns are basically that it's very intrusive and it creates this database to, you know, evade and personal identification information. You know, when Revenue Tax came out and we decided to implement this, we thought, wow, this is the perfect time and opportunity for us to enhance our security in our system, because it was lacking. It wasn't to say that we didn't vet them. We did vet them, but we kept photocopies of information, and that information that was kept was subject to the degradation of documents when they're kept physically. We didn't have the ability to store them digitally. So that's basically some of the benefits. Why did we choose it? We chose it at that time because $2 million was made available from the Department of Homeland Security for us to implement the act, but also for us to take advantage of strengthening the controls and the authenticity and improving that in our driver's license system. And yes, absolutely, that's correct. I think one of the biggest problems that happened was probably the department's inability to come straight out and to be forward with the public and even to the lawmakers. I know Senator San Agustin alluded that when he points to Title 16 of the code, it's not in there, and we should. When he's mentioned, he's probably waiting for me to say something. We should actually codify it and say that Guam driver's licenses now are modeling the Real ID Act, and participation, you know, is optional for those who choose so. And there are so many other different requirements that are accepted by the Real ID. There's enhanced driver's licenses that some states implement that allow you for domestic travel. He's absolutely correct as a veteran. He can enter any federal facility with his military ID and so forth. So, you know, it was kind of almost like a triple win for Revenue Tax to do to implement it. It was money available for us to upgrade and enhance our security. It was also the opportunity for those who had the driving privilege to say, hey, we can't afford a passport that's so costly, and so we can take this Guam driver's license and use it for domestic flying and also to enter federal facilities. And, you know, that's pretty much where we're at now. And we know we're at a vulnerable stage to complete and to comply with it. I think right now, this is the best opportunity for us to become transparent and clearly tell the public what's happening, where we're at, tell the legislature where we're at, and go forward from there.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. I think with that note, and I'd like to also recognize Senator Talina Nelson has also joined us today. On that note, then I would be expecting a form of a letter from the director, deputy director, that we're going to go in and draft to change, to amend the Guam Code, Title 16, Chapter 3. And maybe we should follow that lead. If we're looking at 2020, then by 2020, then Guam will be required, driver license will be a real ID. Because you're never going to, I'm going to tell you right now, TSA, Department of Homeland Security, will never get rid of passport. And you know why? Because foreign countries do not recognize the United States Real ID Act. Foreign countries recognize your passport. Okay, so let's make sure the people of Guam know that. When you're leaving Guam, bring your passport, even if you have a real ID. Because if the plane ever gets diverted to Japan, you are you're in the worst place in the world because you're stuck on the plane or probably not even out of you won't get off the plane because if you only got a real ID, have a seat on the plane. And I don't believe the people of Guam should be inconvenient. But looking at 2020 to maybe be a mandate and continue to allow folks to come in and renew their driver's license. Because when Senator Terlai brought up about the several hours, in November I stood in line for 3 hours. In December I stood in line with my wife for 3 hours to get a new driver's license. And that was terrible. But you know what? I'm going to ask first Senator Talina Nelson if she wants to ask questions before I continue on. Ma'am, nothing? Okay, okay. Okay, let me just ask just a few more. Okay. One question I have is, number one, Director and Deputy Director. I like the announcement that the governor says, or you stated that the governor directive is to open a satellite. I don't like to remind you, but I'll remind you. When we met, when I became the oversight chair, I've asked you about taking a look at the mall, which is the most populated area on this island, the northern end, to take a look at the mall because I met with management and they're willing to work something out at the point where they had advised me that they will seriously consider offering it on a short term, free, and then they'll work with the cost. That didn't go anywhere. Number two, I talked to Monte Mesa at the GPO, and he said he was willing to work something out. The department didn't go forward on that one. Number three, I talked to Mr. Jim Gillen at Public Health, and he offered a place there for a satellite for Department of Revenue and Tax. What just bothers me is that, and this was in February or March, and I know for a fact that it was in August when negotiation was happening for Agustin Shopping Center. And I have nothing against the Agustin Shopping Center, except this place doesn't have a lot of people other than during a short period when they're going to work, but up at the mall, up in Dedadu, and down south, which I know, Director, you're from Iran. I know the people down south would have loved to have gone to Public Health to get their ID, their real ID or their driver's license. It just surprises me that last week we met, Director and Deputy Director, and I asked that question. And all I heard from you is, it's coming out soon. The next day, it's a surprise to me that the governor directs it. And I have nothing against that. All I'm concerned about is that the people of Guam are not getting it faster. You started this in August. I know for a fact. I have pictures of the site in September when they're demolishing the wall and putting the, see the ironic things, I know just as many people as you guys know in the business because I'm talking to them and asking them what's available. And all the people of Guam want is to be informed. Every one of my colleagues asked me, Joel, what's going on? Senator Nelson asked me, because for GPD, you know, there's a lot of things going on, and I'm caught with, I'll let you know soon. I should never be put in that predicament when I'm meeting with you folks almost 2 or 3 times a month. And that just surprised me on that one. There's nothing going on for those other satellites, and those are more critical. People of the north have already complained to me. People down south have complained to me. And then the veterans have complained to me because there's a public law that exists today that has not been implemented at the driver's license section. It specifically states the driver's license will have an indication that says you're a veteran. I don't understand why you have, your focus is on the real ID. That's not law, but you have a law that you haven't implemented. I'm very concerned about that because the veterans are asking me, what happened to the bill that was introduced by Senator Uggan, supported by all the colleagues last year? And it's already over a year later, still nothing. Can somebody answer why the veterans are not identified on their driver's license? And what's the course of action to get it done as soon as possible? Because that's law.
First thing, answer your question on the location of the satellite. One of the things that we looked at basically is that why we chose the Agustin Shopping Center is to cater the south and the central. Basically, that's what we looked at. And if we had it over in the American, it's very close to our department. So, you know, those people there. But eventually, we want to try and look at other places, you know. But that was the reason why we chose Taganeg to actually to try to take care of the south side and the central side. And our department up at Revenue and Tax Ready is for the north side. So, and GPO, I guess, according to me, didn't have any vacancies. So that's basically what happened on the satellite. But to answer your question on the driver's license, to indicate that who's a veteran, we are working on that, I believe, Senator. And I think before Marie Flores left the department or retired in August, we've been working in that, and we are going to actually put the veteran symbol in the Real ID Act when we actually complete this process in April. So we're in the process of putting the symbol for the veterans.
Okay, my next question, the people of Guam want to really know this. Everybody that lined up early this year to get a supposedly Real ID Real ID card, didn't get one. How are they going to get it now? Because they don't want to get in line for anything no more. It's like enough's enough. The burden was on them to get to you so that the driver's license section can get vetted. The burden should not be on the people now to get in a long line. I mean, I can see if you have a distribution center somewhere where they just come up, one center, you have 10, 20 people ready to give out those Real ID, a replacement. But then at the same token, as you're going to give it out, what is it going to cost the people of Guam for claiming to do something that you're not doing and you're repeating it again? We're talking about cost also. So, Ms. Benito.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that concern. Everybody wants to know that. But, you know, let me just, for the record, DRT never claimed we were Real ID. It was a miscommunication. We just kept saying we're working towards compliance. That's what we kept stating. But what we had to show also was to the stakeholders was that we're working towards it by showing them the progress, and that's by getting all the documents now. And the burden of once 2020 comes around, or 2018, when we are Real ID compliant, that crowd is going to be much bigger than now. So we wanted to go ahead and start easing into that process. But that's a good question. We don't want them to be burdened again with standing in line. That's a great option, maybe possibly a distribution area. Mr. Chair, that's a great option. Another one we also considered was mailing, but when we discussed this last week, that might not be on the table because then you have 2 active driver's license out there. Even if we terminate it on the system, you physically have those 2 driver's license. And so distribution might be an option that we're looking at. And the cost, we haven't sat and discussed the cost yet. I think we will be doing that soon, and we will get back to you on the cost. But, you know, I'd also like to add that with all this implementation of the Real ID, we've never increased the driver's license fee, even though it cost us some money. So those are all things that we're looking at. And again, you know, we just wanted to be proactive as far as getting out this Real ID compliance and vetting and the documents.
Just to add to that, we have those people that really are vetted into our process that don't have to go through that same process again, unless there are some changes, meaning, you know, you're married and your name is different or your passport expired or something like that. But other than that, I think what Marie was saying basically is that we work something out. We want to be within the law. We want to make sure that probably communicate with the AG's office to make sure that what we're doing here is proper and legal, you know, when we do it. But again, we discussed about, mailing it won't work because you'll be having those two license, active drivers. You can only have one active driver's license. So we'll work something out and make sure that these people that are vetted already don't go through the process again. And if once we become compliant in April 30, we'll do something, we'll let the public know. Yes.
Okay. When you identified fees, maybe Jesse will probably be able to answer it, is that what's the difference in the fees on Guam for driver's license versus anywhere else? What's the cost difference? Do you know that? If it's like it's 25 on Guam for 3 years, how is it in the mainland? Because I know in some states that it's as good for 10 years. For some, I think they're long periods. That maybe you can answer that, Jess.
I'm not sure about fees. However, with expiration, one state like Arizona probably is good from the day it was issued, is good for about 15, 20 years of the driver's license. But as far as fees, I have no recollection of any fees and how much they charge for a license.
Mr. Poe?
A lot of the state now, because of the real ID, I think it cuts it down to minimum of no more than 8 years. Most of the state now is that I've seen is they're good for 6 years. Guam is 3, and of course we have the option of 5. But some state it goes anywhere from 2 years to 6 years. The reason for that is because there's some state where has to do with age of a person, anywhere from 16 to the age of 30 is like 6 years. Anywhere from, I believe, all the way up to 70 is down to 2 years. So it varies in a lot of states as far as expiration.
Mr. Poe?
Yes, Senator, just in addition to what Mr. Salas had mentioned, you'd be surprised in the states the fees are a lot higher in some states than they are in Guam. Our driver's license fees are almost like our real property tax fees. They're low. And the reason being, again, is we offer the 3-year option or the 5-year option. But what some states do is they actually break it down, again, for those drivers that are high risk. High risk are those under 16 or under 25. They even put a maximum up to 70 years of age, and the renewable period is for 2 years. And the fees vary, and they can go anywhere from $80 to $150. There was one state, and I was quite shocked, I don't recall which one, who's recently implemented and complied, and they're actually in compliance with Homeland Security. They only raised their driver's license fee $4 for the Real ID Act compliance. And that really depends, again, on what support they get, what funding they get, from the state itself to implement that. And, like I said, we've received a lot of enhancements, both technological-wise and even in the security features. So we really haven't sat down to say, what is it going to cost us in the long term? But initially, a lot of the cost that wasn't passed through to the driver's license customers was because of the grant money.
So could you tell us today, what does it truly cost to issue a driver's license? Is it $25, or is it more, or is it a lot less?
One thing I can mention, Senator, is that if you were compared to a business, basically, you normally look at your input and output. I mean, what is really costing the government? We incurred a lot of expense. We got a lot of money from the grant from HSS, but somebody has to really sit down and really look at it and see, because we are in fact incurring a lot of expenses right now for the Real ID. I think we're in the $100-some thousand that we're pumping into to comply with these support the Real ID Act. So those are the things that we're going to look at. We just didn't have the time to look at it, but we discussed this earlier about looking into this and see what we can do to come up with a reasonable amount that we may propose. But there are added costs to coming up with a security Real ID license that have all these security features. It's costing us money, a lot of money right now. So it's something that we will look at and eventually come up with some, recommendations, compare, like Bo and Jesse and Marie are saying, compare with other states, what their cost is. Some are very minimal because they probably have grants or other subsidies to run the driver's license. So we just have to sit down and look at it.
So I'm going to hope that Marie's going to be looking at grants first before we increase the fee. And the only reason I asked that question is what is it costing? Because I know that the department is absorbing the cost of free driver's license out there also. Right, Jess? Yes. I know you give out a lot of that, the military. And that's why we need to know what is the cost. Because in some way or form, we've got to recognize that. And the people of Guam's got to understand that, as you say, if you're going to recommend the cost go down or go up, there's got to be a clear statement that there's no grant available. No grant at all. Okay? And then on that same note, when you identified the mall, you didn't want to set up the satellite station. We did talk about it. I worked with the Department of Land Management. We're going to identify a site to move revenue and tax away. So you're going to need to go into the mall and find a way to get a satellite, because you're going to be moving closer to Gloria B. Nelson's compound on the back road. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. And that's why I say that, is because I've worked with the Department of Land Management, and we're looking at 11 acres to put in a bill to introduce, to hopefully convince my colleagues to allow you to move and stop paying for rent and start paying for your own building and start growing from there. Because it's not making sense. You're paying rent. If the typhoon really hits Guam, glory be, we've got to pray that the records of everybody, their income tax, everything, I honestly believe will be gone. Will be totally destroyed. And the only thing Marie and John's going to tell me is that our computer's still working. But none of what you vetted and everything will be there. Everything will be gone. Only because just that's the way the building is. The building's over 30 years old. I know that, would you like to, no, not yet? Senator Terlai, I know you wanted to ask. You have a bunch of questions.
Absolutely. I feel like some of my questions weren't answered either. And the more I hear, I have to agree with the chair that I'm concerned with this transparency. And I'm trying to be very open because I'm new, so I wasn't here probably when you decided to implement this. But it really does feel like it was implemented without, the public knowing, even the legislature perhaps knowing that you had decided to implement it, what the cost was going to be to the government of Guam. This is a very controversial program in some states because they argued it, you're collecting private data and you're storing it, which, we already know it's stored at different places, but not in a government of Guam agency, like altogether like that. So there's very high risk. And when you said that you increased your security, I mean, is it, I think we should have heard about all of those things maybe before you decided to implement the program. And it's like a lot of grant programs where we are very quick to accept the grant money, but the long-term costs then, of course, are going to be put onto the government of Guam. And I agree, I'd like to see an assessment of these costs. And if you're going to send down a bill like the chair suggests, that I think we need to have a full discussion on it, right? Like, what are the benefits for Guam? Because we know this is a benefit for, places where they don't really use passports, like traveling in the States. I mean, they don't need passports. But everyone on Guam pretty much has learned that you need passports to travel almost anywhere. And so, yes, and I really want that to be very, very clear. And Paul, you had said that you agree that according to the Real ID Act, the Federal Real ID Act, which has not been approved for Guam yet, but that if you have a passport, it pretty much takes care of, it's the option, right? We could have a regular driver's license and a passport, which almost everybody on Guam is, that's their goal, is to get that for travel anywhere. Is that right? And they could use that in place of a real ID. All right, and I want that to be very, very clear. And when you implement this, yes, because now we have, on top of the beginning of the program and then the long lines, and you had told us it's summer. And don't worry, this is just an influx of people during the summer who are getting their IDs, and this is going to go away. And we could take care of it in-house. And I had a lot of faith in you, and I just trusted that that was going to happen. But then when we came into the budget hearing, we were told, no, we absolutely need to add on additional employees in order to relieve the lines. And I was very stunned to hear that, because I felt like we had not been told, accurately the picture. That if it's just a temporary problem in this new process or in a influx of summer applicants versus a long-term, we're going to need now a permanent satellite place for 8 more Department of Motor Vehicles, application places. I don't know. I'm perplexed by that, because I thought before you started to implement this, the lines were not that long. There was a time when the lines were great. They were very manageable. I thought your online registration program was good, even before these long lines. And so I thought you were doing very, very well. And then all of a sudden, things became ridiculously long with no reprieve. And I'm also perplexed by, your response to that. Like, why? I can't understand that at all.
Okay, and I'd like to respond. Thank you very much for that, Senator. And yes, the reprieve is coming, December 1st. Now, what had happened is when this administration came on, the Real ID was already in the process. This started in December 2008. So we already took all that money, the previous administration took all that money, we already built it up to where it was at. It was just taking it home now, and that's what we wanted to do for our people. Let's make them have that option. And again, when we first implemented this, the requirements on the renewal, that's when the lines got longer, because now not only new, but also renewal was required to submit the documents. And that's why the long lines, and it never really decreased because of the new requirement on the renewals. But that is the solution that we're working towards. And the permanent solution was the aid staff. We've always been short in staff at driver's license, always, even prior to the Real ID. So all that did was just added additional burden to the staff that was already there. So we always needed the additional staff. And thank you, Legislature Chair San Agustin, for giving us the staff that we truly needed, desperately needed, because again, laws are passed. It's the same people that has to implement and enforce these laws. So
But this
really
one was not a
appreciate it.
law. This one was the Department of Revenue Tax choosing to implement a program, maybe perhaps without enough resources to do it in the long run. So that's the difference, right?
Right.
with
I'm
this
just talking
Real
about
ID,
overall
I'd
and
like
how
to-
I appreciate you guys giving us the staff. Thank
The
you.
2008 documents, if those are available, if you could also forward those down, I'd appreciate it. I want to see how they signed us up for this. I guess it was a grant, and what the obligations are, and that type of thing. And your estimates, of course, of the costs.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Senator Terlahi, just one, I guess I was trying to listen specifically to your questions, and one of your questions, again, deals with how we're going to protect the personal identification information. Well, I'll tell you, this is not something new to Rev and Tax. Since Rev and Tax has been charged with protecting taxpayer information, we go through a very difficult review from the Internal Revenue Service. Every 3 years, the IRS sends out what they call a safeguard review that's conducted by them, and it takes a look at our system, our firewall, how we protect taxpayer information, how we destroy taxpayer information after it's completed, whether it's hard copy or digital. The interesting thing, like I said, going about this again with the driver's license and why it was done back then is because we found this as an opportunity to take that same personal identifiable information on the driver's license side and improve the safeguards. So very much similar safeguard requirements for our already income tax information is almost modeled in this Real ID Act too.
That's great to hear,
that's
yes.
at least to give the people of Guam some sense that we're not there and we're just collecting all this data. We realize that, and I'll tell you, most recently, and you can hear in the paper, there's been information about some people taking taxpayer information and using it for other means. And we do, like I said, we look down upon that. We look at people who abuse that to be taken criminally and prosecuted. And again, just to let the people and you folks know, it is a very serious concern.
Very glad to hear that you're using the same processes that you use in the income tax safeguard.
Yes.
Yes, good. And yeah, you're right. We've seen stories in the newspaper, I mean, you know, about breaches by huge corporations that we assume have, you know, millions of dollars to spend on security, correct? Even the IRS, you're right. So, okay, that's good to know. Can you tell us who has access to your motor vehicle license information right now? Does the grant guarantee, when we signed on to this grant, did we guarantee access to this information to certain parties?
Access is very limited, extremely. And if we're going to hire an outside vendor or another vendor, we have to notify them. Not the vendor, but the Social Security Administration, all the stakeholders that are involved that we've shared information with.
Yeah, who are the stakeholders that you share information with?
We're working towards AMVA and Social Security Administration.
What's AMVA?
American Motor Vehicle Administration. Yes.
And you share information with them? Is that
Yes,
standard?
there are conduit right now to receive that information. So we're working with 2 federal agencies.
Okay, AMVA and Social Security information.
Yes, and employees only. Even staff and rev and taxes, the only ones that have access to that would be strictly the driver's license employees.
Okay, thank you. Good to hear. I'm sure the public will be reassured to hear that. Thank you.
Now, Senator Nelson, you have a question, ma'am?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank the Department of Rev and Tax for all the hard work they've been doing. I know we had an interesting dialogue during our budget talking about the allocation of employees. And so before we get into that, I wanted to ask, because we're dealing with a lot of personal identifiable information, I wanted to know what type of security measure exactly do you have in place that protects all these documents, and how do you process it? Do you take a copy of it and you put a hard copy in a file room, or do you take a copy of it and you scan it into a computer database system? What is the process of protecting this PII, you would call it?
I know I'm not an IT person, Senator, but I wish somebody from the IT people were here to answer that question, but I don't know if there's anybody. So we'll try and take that. Sorry for that, but that's more of an IT question. We can basically get back to you on that particular question. Do you know, Jess? Maybe Jessie.
Okay.
You're asking on how the process is done right now as far as collecting the documents and safekeeping it?
And the security measure
And
put
the
in
security
place.
measure. Well, right now, the way it is we scan these documents. If you're holding a Social Security card on itself, then we scan the card directly off from an original document. There's some documents that we're not able to scan through the machine because whether it's too big or too bulky, then of course we run a copy and then we run it through the scanner. Yes, we do also scan or just copy the document in itself, and it's attached to the original application that the applicant has submitted. And yes, we store them in rooms and boxes
And all the employees at DRT that are part of this process touch these documents, right? The Social Security card. In order for me to do a real ID, I have to collect it from them.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
the processor. Yeah.
Okay. And so, you know, Mr. Director, I think this is very important to specify, because this is information that someone can take and use for identity theft. And if you don't have the proper security measures in place, then it's very easy to hack into the system. It's very easy to write down someone's social security card number and use it, you know, as identity theft. And so it leads me to my next question. What kind of information technical support do you have within the agency?
Right now, we do have our IT person, which is headed by Frank Lujan, OTEC, and we also have our vendors, and I'm pretty sure they have security measures. But Paul mentioned earlier on the tax side and that we get visited from our safeguard review of our securities, and we go through that almost annually, which includes part of the entire department. But as far as security-wise, this is something that IT is up to par. In other words, to make sure that our files are safe and they're guarded. So
I can tell you right now, Director, that the security measures that you have in place at DRT, they are not up to par to protect you from a cyber attack. And so that's why I'm asking these questions, because this is the island's database. And if you need to acquire additional funding to protect the island's database from identity theft, then that's something that you need to address. And not, you have to understand the requirement of that. If you tell us it's up to par and then something happens.
What I'm trying to say is that we go through the process with our safeguard review, and our safeguard review, I think for the latest reports that I know, we're okay. In other words, I'm not an IT person, but
Yes.
As far as the results that we get from the safeguard review, I think we've complied with those requirements, I believe, Paul.
Well, I hope that the dialogue will allow more, I guess, consideration, right? And we look at moving forward and taking measures to secure our system. That's the reason why, because I think many times we overlook the cybersecurity piece. And, this is a different kind of battlefield that other special groups, that have ulterior motives, other countries. And I think that we need to start paying a little bit more attention to the database that you collect, because it involves everyone on our island. The next question is, in the budget process, we talked about additional employees. As a matter of fact, DRT was given more than what they requested during the budget hearing, significantly more. And so during the Committee of the Whole, when we were in session discussing the budget, there were, the questions were asked, how long will it take for you to hire these people? What is the process? And so, and this is for you, Ms. Anita, that I know that there was a question with the driver's license piece, right? That the allocation was 6 vehicle registration officers, 5 driver's license examiners, and 4 more additional personnel that you needed. And I know that you had some concern about perhaps changing some of the numbers of what you needed to make DRT fully functional in that piece. And so I just wanted to see where you guys at in this hiring process of these personnel.
Okay. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank you first for pointing out that, we might have some issues. Like the director mentioned, we know that there's security measures in place. How tight or how, is it 100%? We're not sure. We will look into that, though. And remember that, this is a federal requirement. I know that they had to go through stringent security review. And because we're entering in an MOU with Social Security, that's what we're working towards.
And I'm glad you're working towards it, yes.
They are going to be coming out. They already informed us. Part of the MOU is review, and I believe it's, semi-annual. So they'll be coming out to look at our security also.
Okay.
So we do have to meet strict requirements on that. On the driver's license, we already on the positions, we already submitted most of them. The one that is on hold right now until the end of the week is the PD for driver's license, because it's so old. The PD at DOA is so old, it's over 20 years, and it doesn't include all these new requirements that the employees are working on.
So
we'll
are
have that at
updating
the end
that
of the
too?
week, yes.
Okay. Well, good to know. Thank
Yes.
you so much.
I believe one of the staff is working on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me just follow up on exactly what Senator Nelson brought up in reference to the budget. Director, Deputy Director, it was a hard battle for you to get what you got. Being a former police officer and being a former revenue and tax. If it came down the wire, I would say yes to revenue and tax, but if it was about the people of Guam, I would have said yes to GPD. So I want to make sure you all understand that. And, Mr. Pablo knows where I'm coming from because he's a former criminal investigator. When we're talking about safeguards, that first, then we can move forward. And that's why I'm very concerned. I thank Senator Nelson for asking the questions about the GG1s, because that was one of the most critical things during the budget. And I've been asking, get the GG1s in September, because it's going to take 30 days to get processed. And any problems you're going to run into, it's already October 30th. I've communicated with DOA, and they're just waiting BBMR to clear it. I know you have a bunch of folks on the island that are ready to apply. And I honestly believe they'll meet the requirements. I know Jesse's eager to see what type of people he's going to get and how much headaches he's going to get in training them, so that when 1 December comes, the satellite opens. My follow-up question to the satellite is, how many Treasure Guam people are you moving down there?
I believe two, right?
Two.
Two.
There'll be two.
Okay, in line of that, I'm concerned that ad revenue and tax, you have the Treasure Guam. I have nothing against Treasure Guam, but I'm only concerned that when the Treasure Guam loads up data, they punch in when people pay, it doesn't feed your system right away. Maybe you guys can work something out with DOA, and because you're getting more people for collection, maybe consider taking over half of collection Treasurer's branch office, because you guys get the money. All you do is pass it off to the armored car, but your data will be updated. Because, as the directive is from the governor is to open the satellite, I know there's a directive that he wants you to collect more money so that GPD and the courts can get more money to take care of their business. So that being said, I'm going to pass on to Senator Castro, who has a follow-up question, and if any of my other colleagues have any more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This discussion has evolved onto another topic that I think is really important. If I could summarize it, Mr. Chair, to be on data storage and data sharing. So I do also support the two senators' concerns about how we handle sensitive data. So with that said, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask if we can have a separate roundtable at another time, both with DRT, but also with the Office of Technology. Because I know in my brief tenure as the OTEC, as a CTO, there was an opportunity to tie in emergency communications monies to a disaster recovery plan, and I'm not sure where we're at with that, but I think of much greater importance are the concerns raised by the Vice Speaker and Senator Nelson. I'm also concerned, I'm curious about the protocols that are in place for data sharing. And like the Vice Speaker mentioned earlier, there are some controversial issues associated with Real ID. For example, that kind of tread on the line of protecting our civil liberties. But I don't want to use this as an opportunity to get on my soapbox, but the chairman knows my position, and so does my committee chair here as well for Homeland and Regional Security, about my conservative position on protecting the homeland. And so with that said, just last week, we were hearing anecdotal information about folks coming into the island's waters who are undocumented and perhaps quite possibly even tied very closely to this drug trade. And so to bring it home to today's discussion, I think whether it's the Real ID Act or some enhanced form of a secured personal identification, Director, I really want to encourage your team and the administration to continue the discussion about the need for stricter controls on how we administer requests and issue some types of ID. And I'll give you an example. So the Guam Memorial Hospital provides certain services to our residents, all of them. But we don't require that information be given by them. I think that needs to change. I don't know how yet, but it's an important requirement. But even more important than the requirement to provide identification is the information that's gathered to be shared. And I don't mean to turn this into a long discussion about GMH, but I'll give you an example. So resident X walks into GMH, is treated in the emergency room, is not required to provide identification, but when he or she gets that treatment, let's say in the form of a fingerprint, okay, the folks who pick them up, and you remember this discussion, Deputy Director, about the EMT providing the emergency service, getting, let's say, for example, the fingerprint in the event it's a criminal act, like somebody hits somebody on, it's a traffic violation. So GPD is there, GFD is there, then they turn over custody of the person to GMH for treatment, and then that data never makes it over from GPD and GMH to DRT to reconcile. And so for what it's worth, the Real ID Act, as voluntary as it is for interstate travel, sets into place in my mind certain safeguards that are acknowledged and accepted by the United States federal government for purposes of reconciliation of that individual's identity. Now, what I'm concerned about is a similar system, if not that one, to be able to capture the same information and share it between law enforcement and all other government agencies so that we can do a better job accounting for the type of services rendered and to whom. So again, I do also, just to summarize what I'm trying to say as succinctly as possible, I stand with my colleagues on the need to protect certain civil liberties, and so I maintain that voluntary participation in the Real ID Act be upheld, but I'm also very conservative in my position to protect the homeland. So any form of identification that comes out of DRT, because that is your area of responsibility, I think needs to be strengthened. That's my statement, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Speaker,
Thank
I
you.
think you had a follow-up question.
Yeah. Can you make it then very, very clear for the public, when are you able to issue a real ID? When is that?
Just basically, we're looking at, we requested for the extension up to April 30 of next year with HSS. So we're looking at complying by April 30. And from there, we should be, even before that, we should be communicating with the public on our developments on our Real ID compliant. And like we said earlier, we will try and communicate with those people that have been vetted already, so we'll do something for them. At the same time, people that are coming in to renew their license right now, it's an option. It's a voluntary thing that we you know, in the law says it's a voluntary act and to get a Real ID. But at the same time, we will be also issuing a non-compliant Real ID Act for people that chose not to get a Real ID compliant driver's license. So
Yes, that's what I wanted to confirm,
Yes.
that when you leave here today, you're going to make sure that you have some lines at DMV that say you don't, and that you're going to make, the public will know. I don't know if it's going to be signs, or you issue them something, you know, that's really legal, they can read it, and that says if you have a passport, you will be still allowed to travel with your passport.
Yes.
You will be allowed access to federal buildings. You will be allowed access to military, or you can use it for access to military installations, right, in lieu of a real ID. And that we have lines immediately for those people who just need driver's licenses. And how long do you expect them to wait in lines for driver's licenses now? How long do you expect the line wait to be? Can we sort those lines out for those who want to process all their Real ID information right now for April 2018? Seems a little, I'm not sure how you're going to work that, but so for right now, I wanted to line up and get a driver's license only because it's expired. How long would the line wait be for me then?
well, basically, you know, there's options that we have right now. There's the online scheduler. Of course, people can go in there and schedule. We also have a live, if I'm not mistaken, Jesse, for people that are 65 or older, 55 or older veterans, and with disabilities also. So we have a separate line for that also. So, you know, we have eight cubicles serving these renewals, and also at the same time we're also doing the Guam ID from I believe 8 to 12 noon every day for the Guam ID. So we'll look into it and see how would that work. I know it's nice to go there and say I don't want to be Real ID compliant. I just here to. We'll look into that options because you know if you know, it's going to be a lot of options that we're looking now. How many lines do we have for 65, 55 and older? We have one line? Yes. We have one line already for that. We have one line for the scheduler. So that gives us an option of 656. So we'll look into it and see what we can do to make it better.
I hope you can act on it right away. I really think it's reasonable, and it's unreasonable, really. It's really unreasonable that they had to wait more than 2 hours, and that people waited 7 hours it's beyond unreasonable. I don't even know what the word is for that. So yeah, if we could just implement that right away, and you know, I think just implement it right away. Allow them to come and get their licenses renewed so they don't drive without a license, and they don't have to give up an entire day off work or an entire day, you know, away from their kids just to get that.
I know, and just to talk about, you know, time and waiting time, I think Jesse here and Paul, you know, we talk about it's coming down. You know, wherever you go, there's always a waiting time, and I believe our vendors.
No, I don't think we should debate that. Are you trying to say that it's reasonable?
No, I'm not saying
7 hours? No, come on, let's not debate that. Let's just move on from that, and let's just do our best. That's why I'm asking if you can implement it right away, that we have lines for just renewal of driver's license, and let's not.
We'll do that.
Thank you.
Okay, in closing, I have 3 things I want to just recap. Number 1, veterans ID, the veterans being identified in driver's license, hopefully real soon, because that's already law. This is option, real ID, okay? But law. Recommended changes to Title 16, Chapter 3. Because, you know, there's certain things you want to vet. Let's submit the recommendations so I can get with my colleagues here and we can come up with a nice bill to introduce so we can have the open discussion about the changes on the driver's license. And identify the fees at the same time, please. Come up, recommend it, and why. Okay, and the cost. Well, you know, what's the cost the department's going through? What's the recommended fees? If there's grants out there, so be it. Because grants only enhance you. You know, the fees should be able to keep you sustained beyond that. Okay, and then we also mentioned when we met last week, PSAs, public service announcement. The people of Guam needs to hear you, not hear only Attorney Elizabeth Barrett Anderson saying it's the law. The department should be saying it's an option or it's now the law. You need to file your taxes. If your driver's license expires in 3 years, you have an option of 90 days out, right? 3 months out, registration, and so forth. The department needs to come out more. And that's where my colleagues have brought up is that a lot of people don't know. And there's nothing stopping you, and I think that's a cost that's worth putting out. Because GPD does great on PSAs. Why can't the department do that? And you are actually really the heart of the government of Guam. Every penny that the governor has to decide on how he does his budget goes through your department. Not unless you want to tell me no. If it's not, then I'd be surprised how he justifies where he gets money, because he's not getting it from autonomous agencies. He's only getting it through the Department of Revenue and Tax. Everybody else charges fees, and they try to keep it. But I'd like to see the department step up and move out from where you're at. But PSAs are going to be the key, letting everybody know. Yeah. She's PDN. You wanted to ask, you're from PDN, right? You? Yes. Did you want to ask a question to the panel? Sure, you can ask a question. There wasn't no option for that, but I'll give you that one shot. Go for it. State your name so we know, everybody knows who's asking the question. Thank you.
Hi, half a day. My name is Jeanette Bocanegra. I know some people on this side of the panel already from previous reports I've made. I moved here in January from Texas, so I could tell you the second week of January, I was in that line for over 5 hours, and I should have packed lunch. I got there even before it opened, so I was a little surprised, but I'm glad that this is all being addressed now. My first question is, how will this non-mandatory requirement then affect people who would have to appear in court or federal building before a judge to contest a criminal charge? If they're not able to enter the building because they choose not to be compliant, how is that going to function?
I think, ma'am, if the individual is required to appear before the court,
there's
That's
an
not really
exception.
that's not really an issue with the Department of Tax, because they're offering for you to get a real ID. If you as an individual need a real ID to get in, it behooves you to get one. And if you don't, and if they don't give it yet, then it behooves you to apply for a passport. Bring all your
Right.
identification, because that is not an issue with the department or the Gov Guam. That is you as an individual. The court has called you, show up.
Right. Okay, good. And then a comment I had, I know I addressed this with Director Camacho. I asked for signs last time I was there to be posted on the front windows, the doors, I guess you could say, the entrance, so that there would be no confusion that real IDs are not currently available. This suggestion was posed by myself in September. I haven't been there recently, so I'm wondering if this has happened, because again, I understand there's been confusion in this transition, but certain people are there and they're waiting 2, 3, 4, 5 hours thinking they're going to get one, and then they get to the front of the line and say, oh no, we're not real ID compliant. So then in their mind they say, well, if I would have known, if somebody would have told me this before, I wouldn't have stood in this line to get issued a non-real ID Act compliant ID, and then have to come back later, like Vice Speaker Terlaje said, to wait in line again and pay again for a real ID compliant. So I'm just wondering, have those signs been posted? That was my suggestion to the director. I don't know if anything's been done about that.
I believe every single processor there is aware that this is something that is voluntarily right now. So they have an option whether to be vetted at that time or just renew or get a driver's license without being vetted, in other words. So yes, you know, we're getting that across to every single person that comes in, that it's optional.
I think to your question, which I got a whisper from Ms. Benito, they're going to get the sign today. There's vendors out there that can create the sign. They just need to put the verbiage, and they can post it. And I would actually recommend that it be posted outside, against
outside.
the wall,
Correct.
so when they're walking
So
up,
they can read it while they're standing in line.
if anybody says, I didn't notice the sign,
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
And
we're working on that. We're also working on FAQs, and that would hopefully be on our website by the end of the week. And we'll also post that on in the building, all right? Thank you. And the PSA, Public
as a matter
Service
of fact, they'll be
Announcement.
calling PDN and asking you if you can promote some of their stuff on your website, their PSAs, that talks about the issues, not only driver's license, but
Yes,
also real property tax,
Every
everything
area.
that's going.
Yes.
Okay?
And Mr.
Seasonal.
Chair, that's a great idea. We have real property tax coming up that's due soon. We can put
Yes.
that out, driver's license, everything, you know, that is going to be renewed or due.
Business
We
license,
can put it on
everything.
there. Yes. Okay, thank you.
I guess, any further questions from my colleagues? None? This kind of wraps up the roundtable, and it is now 10:30. This concludes the roundtable meeting with the Department of Revenue and Taxation, reference to driver license section, the issues on Real ID Act, and I thank the people of Guam for listening, and I know they'll be able to watch it again, repeat it throughout the day. So thank you. Have a nice day.